The Gestapo called her the White Mouse. They had a file on her thicker than a Bible, a bounty on her head worth 5 million francs, and not one of their agents could find her. She moved through occupied France like smoke, appearing, vanishing, changing identities the way other women changed shoes. She was on their most wanted list across 3 countries. She was the single most hunted Allied agent in all of Western Europe, and every time the net closed around her, she was already gone, already laughing, already pouring wine somewhere they would never think to look. Her name was Nancy Wake, and before the war she had been a journalist, a socialite, a woman who wore expensive perfume and danced until 3 in the morning and married a wealthy Frenchman who adored her. She was not supposed to be a spy. She was not supposed to be anything the history books would remember. She was supposed to live comfortably in Marseille, host dinner parties, grow older gracefully in a city that rewarded beauty and charm and the right connections. And then the Germans came, and something in Nancy Wake, something she may not have fully known was there until the moment it was required, decided that it had seen enough. What she did next was not the clean, cinematic kind of bravery that war movies are built around. It was messier than that, and colder, and more sustained, and far more ruthless than any script would dare to write, because audiences might not believe it. She organized escape lines that moved hundreds of Allied airmen out of France before the Gestapo could get to them. She smuggled weapons through checkpoints in vegetable carts and beneath the floorboards of cars and inside packages that German inspectors opened and waved through because the woman handing them over was smiling too openly to be hiding anything. She forged documents. She bribed officials. She drank grown men under the table at Nazi checkpoints because a drunk woman, the Germans assumed, could not possibly be the most dangerous person in the room. That assumption cost them the war in at least a dozen small ways they never fully traced back to her. She cycled 300 miles through enemy-held territory in 72 hours to deliver intelligence when every other communication line had been destroyed, arriving with bleeding hands and legs that could barely hold her upright, and immediately asked what needed doing next. She trained French resistance fighters in the mountains, commanded raids on German positions, coordinated weapons drops, and navigated the impossible internal politics of resistance groups that were as likely to fight each other as the enemy. And once, because there was no other option, and she did not believe in other options when this one was available, she killed an SS sentry with her bare hands to prevent him raising an alarm, because a gunshot would have been heard, and silence was the one weapon that never ran out of ammunition. The Gestapo searched for her for years. They tapped phones, followed leads, interrogated people who knew her name but not her face. They circulated descriptions. They arrested her associates and pressed them for information, and some of those associates gave them nothing, and some gave them fragments, and none of it was ever enough, because Nancy Wake had been designed by experience and temperament and sheer bloody-minded will for exactly this kind of pursuit, the kind where the fox stays a step ahead, not through luck, but through the specific intelligence that knows which way the dogs are going to turn before they turn. They came close enough, several times, that the people helping her were captured and executed while she was still in motion, still one move ahead, still the white mouse who could not be caught. People died protecting her. She knew this. She carried it. She kept moving anyway because stopping would have meant that the people who died protecting her had died to protect nothing, and that was the one outcome she refused to accept. And here is the thing about Nancy Wake that the Gestapo file never captured, the thing that no bounty poster and no intelligence report could quite contain. She was not running from them out of fear. She was not the reluctant hero who stumbled into resistance work and found herself in too deep to back out. She was running because running was how she kept hurting them, and hurting them was the thing she had chosen to do with her life for as long as the war required it. She was not surviving. She was fighting every single day, in every possible way available to her, with a consistency and a ferocity that made her not just the most wanted woman in occupied Europe, but arguably the most effective single agent the Allied cause produced on French soil. This is her story. It starts in New Zealand, takes a long turn through Sydney and Paris, and the champagne-bright salons of pre-war Europe, moves through the grinding, dangerous years of the French resistance, and ends in the mountains of the Auvergne, where a woman the Nazis spent years trying to catch was busy teaching men half her age how to fight. Pay attention, because this kind of life does not happen twice. Nancy Wake was born in Wellington, New Zealand in 1912, the youngest of 6 children, and she grew up in Australia after her family moved to Sydney when she was 2. Her father abandoned them not long after, which meant Nancy grew up watching her mother stretch money across more mouths than it comfortably covered, and somewhere in that experience she developed the quality that would define her entire life. A deep, almost cellular refusal to accept the situation she had been handed as the final word on what her situation was going to be. At 16, she ran away from home, with a small inheritance left by an aunt, and funded herself to London and then to Paris, where she learned French and found work as a freelance journalist, and discovered with some surprise that she was very good at making people talk. Paris in the early 1930s was the kind of city that could make a young woman from Sydney feel like the world had been hiding its best self until she arrived, and Nancy felt exactly that. She moved through its social circles with an ease that came naturally to someone who was charming and sharp and genuinely curious about people, and she covered stories across Europe that brought her into contact with the rising tide of something ugly moving through Germany. She was in Vienna in 1933 when she witnessed Nazis publicly whipping Jews in the streets, and she stood on the pavement watching it and felt something settle in her like concrete setting. A decision, though she wouldn't have called it that yet. A quiet and furious no that she would spend the next 12 years converting into action. She met Henri in 1936, a wealthy French industrialist from Marseille, who was sophisticated and generous and deeply in love with her from approximately the 3rd conversation they had. They married in 1939, months before Germany invaded Poland, and the world stopped being the world it had been. Henri's money and social position gave Nancy access to exactly the kind of cover that someone running escape lines and weapons shipments needed. She was a wealthy socialite. She was known. She was the last person you would suspect, and she used every inch of that cover with a thoroughness that intelligence services spend years trying to teach operatives and mostly fail. She began moving. Escaped Allied prisoners and airmen along underground routes through France and into Spain, connecting with the Pat O'Leary network, and eventually becoming one of its most active and valuable couriers. She bribed officials and smuggled forged papers, and transported people across borders, and did it all while attending dinner parties and wearing good dresses and pouring drinks for German officers, who had no idea the woman refilling their glass had spent the morning arranging their enemy's escape. By 1942, the Gestapo had her name. Not her face, not her address, not enough to arrest her, but the name Nancy Wake attached to a pattern of activity that was costing them people and resources and escaped prisoners who should have been in camps. They began tightening the net. Her phone was tapped. Her movements were watched. Henri, recognizing the danger before she was willing to admit it, urged her to leave France while she still could. She refused. Then the net got tighter, arrests around her got closer, and in 1943, Nancy Wake did the only thing that her specific combination of courage and practical intelligence allowed. She escaped over the Pyrenees on foot in winter, a brutal crossing that took days and cost her toenails, and left her exhausted in a way she rarely admitted later, and made it to London, where the Special Operations Executive looked at the file on the woman who had evaded the Gestapo for 3 years and decided she was exactly what they needed, and immediately began training her to go back. The Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was Winston Churchill's secret army, the organization he had created in 1940 with the instruction to set Europe ablaze. It recruited people with languages and nerve and the particular psychological profile that allowed someone to function under conditions designed to produce paralysis. And when Nancy Wake arrived at their offices in London in 1943, she had already demonstrated, through 3 years of operational experience in occupied France, that she had all of those qualities in unusual abundance. Her training covered weapons, explosives, unarmed combat, radio operation, parachuting, and the specific mental disciplines required for covert work, how to behave at checkpoints, how to build a cover story and inhabit it, how to manage the fear that came with knowing one wrong answer ended everything. The instructors who trained her noted that she was exceptionally good at the practical components and utterly indifferent to the danger involved. One training report described her attitude toward risk as essentially unbothered. She described it herself, years later, with characteristic bluntness. She had decided the Nazis needed to be stopped, and she was going to help stop them, and the possibility of dying in the process was simply part of the arrangement. She parachuted into France on the night of February 29, 1944, landing in the Auvergne region in central France where the Maquis, the French resistance fighters who had taken to the mountains rather than submit to German forced labor programs, were operating in significant numbers but were poorly armed, poorly organized, and in urgent need of the weapons and training and leadership that the SOE was positioned to provide. Nancy was dropped as part of a team tasked with coordinating this support, and within weeks she had become one of the most operationally effective agents the SOE had in France. She was direct in a way that the French fighters initially found startling and came to deeply respect. She did not soften assessments, did not manage feelings, did not pretend a plan was good when it was going to get people killed. She knew weapons, and she taught weapons, and she participated in raids rather than organizing them from a distance, because she had understood from the beginning that the authority that mattered in the mountains was not conferred by a London briefing document, but earned by showing the men you were working with that you were willing to share what you were asking them to risk. The raid on Montluçon in June 1944 is the clearest example of what Nancy Wake had become by that point in the war. Intelligence had identified a German garrison that needed to be hit, the kind of target that the Maquis could reach, but that required enough coordination and firepower to execute without being destroyed in the attempt. Nancy planned the operation, led part of the assault, and the raid succeeded in destroying the target while extracting the attacking force. A result that required both tactical competence and the kind of controlled aggression under fire that cannot be faked and cannot be trained in from the outside. She was by this point commanding several thousand resistance fighters across the region, coordinating weapons drops, managing the politics of French. Resistance groups that were as likely to fight each other as the Germans, and doing all of it while the Gestapo, who still did not have her face, continued to circulate the file of the White Mouse through every checkpoint and garrison in France. When the war ended, Nancy Wake was the most decorated Allied servicewoman of the entire conflict. France gave her the Croix de Guerre with 3 palms and the Médaille de la Résistance. America gave her the Medal of Freedom. Britain gave her the George Medal. She wore the decorations once, at a ceremony, and then put them in a box and went back to living, because she was Nancy Wake, and what she had done in the war was not the kind of thing she needed a box of medals to remind her of. She had set out to hurt the Nazis, and she had hurt them consistently and professionally, and at great personal cost for 6 years. And the White Mouse, who had never been caught, had also never stopped. And somewhere in a Gestapo archive, there is still a file, 5 million francs, thick, that ends not with her capture, but with the defeat of everyone who built it.